Good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. I'm Bonnie Weddle, the coordinator of the Electronic Records Unit at the New York State Archives and co-chair of the State Electronic Records Initiative's Education and Programming Subcommittee. Welcome to today's webinar, which is part of our Spring 2020 series. Our May webinar, slide please, is happening at the end of the month, which is a little unusual for us. And Cal Lee of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill is going to do an updated version of his extremely popular Fall 2019 presentation on Bit Curator for State Archives. We'll close out the Spring 2020 series in June with a webinar focused on the State Electronic Records Initiative itself, what it's accomplished, where it's going, and most importantly, how you can get involved. We'll take a summer break, and then our Fall 2020 series of webinars will begin in September. Slide, please. Given that so many of us are looking for ways to keep learning and growing while away from our places of employment, I'd like to take this opportunity to call your attention to a couple of online resources that SERI has developed. Managing digital content over time is a modular training resource that focuses on the basics of identifying, selecting, acquiring, storing, and preserving, managing, and providing access to electronic records of enduring value. It's based on the Library of Congress's Digital Preservation Outreach and Education curriculum, and it's been expanded to address the specific needs and concerns of state government archivists. Managing digital content over time is an excellent introductory or refresher course. At the moment, our friends at the Utah State Archives are hosting this resource for us, and you'll find the URL in the slide deck when it's posted to the COSA site. If you are filled with a burning need to access this resource right away, you'll also find this link embedded in the slide deck for last month's SERI webinar, and that slide deck is already on COSA's website. Our FAQs on BitRot explains what BitRot is and how to reduce the risk that it will affect your records. It's 10 minutes long, it's non-technical, and it's suitable for records creators as well as archivists and records managers. You'll find it on COSA's YouTube channel, or you can just Google FAQs on BitRot, and it will pop right up. And for a few coming attractions, we're currently working on a 12-part series of practical digital preservation videos. The first 2 videos are actually done. They will be posted online as soon as the people who can post them return to their offices where they can access the software needed to post them. And we've got a crew of people working behind the scenes to develop the next videos in the series. So stay tuned. Slide, please. And now to the business at hand. As you'll soon discover, today's webinar is going to be a little more active than the usual SERI webinar, and today's presenters will also be discussion facilitators. Carly Dearborn is the public policy archivist with the Ohio State University Libraries. She manages the Ohio Congressional Archives, or OCA, which was founded with the acquisition of the papers of Senator John Glenn. Carly is responsible for promoting and expanding the holdings of the OCA through outreach, instruction, and reference services, and provides support to the members of the Ohio delegation to the U.S. Congress on access and preservation of their records. Previously, Carly was the digital preservation and electronic records archivist at Purdue University. She has a master's degree in information science from the University of Texas at Austin and a bachelor's degree in history and political science from the University of South Dakota. While self-isolating and when she is not panic scrolling through her newsfeed, she enjoys going on long walks with her dog Mouse, finding the perfect chocolate chip cookie recipe, and binge watching the show Schitt's Creek. Nathan Tallman is the digital preservation librarian at Penn State University Libraries, where he coordinates policies, workflows, and best practices to ensure the long-term preservation and accessibility of the library's born analog and born digital collections. He also advises on equipment, infrastructure, and vendors for Penn State digital content. Prior to his arrival at Penn State, Nathan was the digital content strategist at the University of Cincinnati and an associate archivist at the American Jewish Archives. He holds a master's degree in information library science from the University of Buffalo. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Carly and Nathan.
Thanks so much, Bonnie, and thank you all for joining us today as we discuss what I assume is our favorite topic, documentation. So this webinar is based on a workshop that Nathan and I conducted with another colleague last year at Best Practices Exchange. And it was a fun way to engage around a task that we all deal and struggle with in various levels. So for the purposes of our chat today, we'll be discussing user documentation, or the documentation that you and your institution use for internal functions such as processing or digitization or reference services. We won't necessarily go into higher level policy documentation. However, a lot of what we discuss can also be applied there. So here's our roadmap for the next hour or so. We'll discuss the value, approach, and tools for creating and maintaining documentation. And we'll also introduce some resources for you to go to borrow and or share your own workflows. And since many of us are working remotely these days, I think updating and cleaning up documentation is maybe something we're doing or something we can work towards. And so we'll provide some tips for getting started with that. And then finally, we're going to try to recreate what we thought was one of the most valuable parts of our in-person session, which was the small group discussions. We're just two people with very specific experiences around documentation issues. And so we really want to open it up to your expertise and experience and learn about any tips that y'all have had when approaching documentation and also any challenges you face. So next slide.
So good morning. The slide sometimes seems to go back on me without my control, so I'll try to monitor those. Thank you for joining us today. Starting off here with the value of documentation, Carla will talk a little bit more about what documentation is later, but we wanted to start with the why, and that's the value of documentation. On each of these sort of section title slides, we have a question here for folks to reply to in the chat. Unfortunately, as I'm sharing the PowerPoint, I don't seem to be able to see that chat to be able to respond to. But again, it's part of trying to have folks learn from each other as well as anything that might come out of this webinar, because we are resources for each other. So thinking about the value of documentation, documentation can be difficult. It can be a lot of work. It has to involve a lot of people. There's process involved, so that we all arrive at a shared understanding, and that can take time. So it can be something that people try to avoid because of that time and the process involved. But working together to achieve that shared understanding really brings team cohesion, accountability, and lays a strong foundation for growth of a program. We want to create sustainable documentation. It's an investment of our time and energy. But there are direct costs, there are opportunities cost, but investments have payoff. And we feel that the value of your documentation is a direct linear equation to the growth potential and sustainability. Investing in usable, iterative, understandable documentation can help you make that pivot from projects to ongoing programs. And good documentation makes it easier to collaborate with new colleagues who might come into a project that we're working on or have intersections between our work. It's easier to transition functions to new roles if there's a change of responsibilities over who is performing or involved in certain tasks. It helps to transfer knowledge and onboard new employees. So documentation can be thought of really as a subset of knowledge management. And although good documentation can't solve all problems, without it, you're seriously limiting your potential for growing the program.
Okay, and with this next section, we really kind of want to get at the what of documentation, how it's structured, how your institution or your team really approaches it. So I guess, so in the chat, if you could tell me what you think about your internal documentation at your organization. Is it helpful to you? Does it feel like it's an afterthought? Is it a mess, or is it really well integrated in your trainings and workflows? So go ahead and chat a brief phrase or an adjective describing your organization's approach to documentation. And you can hit the next slide, Nathan. Thank you. So an adjective that I would use to describe my current documentation situation is a little unwieldy, which in my research I found is really not an uncommon experience. So the approach that I've put on the screen here is introduced by Daniela Procida of DVO, and it really seeks to address exactly that bulk problem. The problem of the 50-page PDF files that we call our working documentation. I recommend, and we'll share links and resources, of course, with the slide deck. I really recommend looking into some of his work and a lot of his keynotes. They really break this down a little bit more. But briefly, he argues that in order to make our documentation usable and effective, it should be organized around these 4 principles. So we'll start with tutorials in the upper left corner. Now, this is the lesson that takes the user or the reader through a series of steps to complete something. The function of tutorials are learning-oriented and practical, and they must be repeatable for every type of learner. And it's also the first place that learners should go, or new learners should go to be oriented to a new protocol or workflow. And if we were to apply a tutorial or some of these examples to the digital preservation world, I think that, the overview of your digital preservation process would be a tutorial. It will introduce some universal truths to the process without going into detail. So for example, it may say that the first step is to create a disk image of all removable media in your digital collections, but it won't go into detail about how you use the imaging software. So to the right of tutorials and how-to guides on kind of the practical section of this little grid here, how-to guides take the reader through the steps required to solve common problems. You can think of them as recipes or directions, and they're really problem-oriented. And to follow up on our digital preservation example, this would be the guide that would explain how to use a certain tool or software to do a particular task. Example, how to take a disk image with X software. And then the two lower types of documentation are address more theoretical knowledge. So the explanation documentation is sections of your documentation that clarify and illuminate a particular topic, background or contextual information. This isn't the place where instruction or technical description occurs. So example of this may be, documentation relating to how digital preservation fits into the larger ecosystem of your library or your institution. And it isn't necessarily designed for doing the work, but it kind of addresses that why question. And finally, reference documentation is technical descriptions of tools or machinery and how to use it. It should be fact-based and to the point. And examples may include detailed descriptions of removable media found in collections, maybe their use history, how to identify them, how to handle them, and how to store them. Again, they're useful when you're working, but they're also kind of more contextual information and theoretical knowledge. And so you can kind of see how this grid divides those principles into practical and theoretical steps and, doing work and kind of learning work. And so you will need all of these types of documentation, and we probably all have them to some extent in our existing documents. But now it's just a matter of pulling them out and structuring them so that it's no longer so bulky, but it kind of meets the need of all the different types of users that are coming to your documents. Next slide, please. So when updating or creating new documentation, it's key to do this in a way that encourages community building and participation. So we want to pick a format and a style that is the best fit for people using it and is conducive to the work. It needs to be something that people are going to want to use because we need buy-in from everyone. And I think Nathan later on will introduce some tools and programs that are good for building out your documentation. But it is really important to think about, is a new tool right for you at this moment? It can work depending on the type of environment that you have or the type of team that you have, but it can often isolate folks and make them feel a little alienated from the process and end up being a little counterproductive. So it's something we encourage you to really think through. And then, even down to how you're organizing the text of your document, how you format your tutorials and your how-to guides and your reference materials, making sure that your section headings and your titles are really clear so that folks know exactly where they're going and what they need. Using short, clear, and inductive paragraphs is also really important. And an inductive paragraph presents the conclusion at the beginning and then follows up with the evidence. So very much like journalism, don't bury the lead, make that important information very upfront. And it's also important to remember that, users are in use cases and users are going to vary over time. And so folks need to really be able to quickly identify what they need when they need it. And then finally, considering access or who you're writing the documentation for, considering your audience, ensuring it doesn't speak above or below a comprehension level. And I also think that considering tone is really important. A lot of times documentation is a learning instrument and tool. And so, ensuring that you're empathetic to new learners, to your process, and that you're creating a safe learning environment in your documentation is something that I find we don't really talk about very much, but thinking about that as we're working through language issues. And then, of course, it's always beneficial to discuss roles and permissions, roles, who's responsible for certain sections or who's responsible for making sure things are updated, but also what you need to restrict access to, whether things need to be isolated to certain teams or whether you can even share them with a larger, preservation library community, I think is an important thing to consider. And next slide.
So thinking a bit about how we create and maintain, how do we do documentation? I'm curious to hear from folks about how they currently do this in their organizations. And I seem to occasionally get a little alert at the top when a chat's come through, but I might not be able to read the whole message. But it would be good to know, like, how are folks doing this now, and is it working for you? So, go ahead.
Go ahead. While we're waiting for folks to add any information in the chat, I just wanted to say the answer to Carly's question about describing the state of documentation, there were a couple of people who said that the documentation at their institutions was incomplete. And one person did say that they're actually using this time of telework to improve documentation.
That's great. Thanks, Bonnie. Yeah, we'll have some additional information on how to get started on the telework documentation.
Yeah, it's a good activity.
All right, and we've also had a couple of people say one institution is using a structured template in a Word document. They're still working on getting colleagues to buy into that. And another is using Google Doc and Google Drive folders, and there are templates for different kinds of documents.
All right, well, those all sound familiar to me in my experience creating and using documentation in organizations. We'll actually refer to some of those shortly here and maybe talk some of the pros and cons for each of these approaches. But as Carly was indicating, you really want to use something that's going to work for your community. And so being careful about that we're not choosing platforms and technologies that might be alienating to folks. Diving in a little bit to some of those tools, something I like to use for documentation is a version control system. A version control system is more often talked about in software development communities. Git, a particular software for version control, is a distributed version control system that tracks changes in source code. And that's really what version control was originally about here, is to being able to track changes over time to software code. But it can be very helpful for documentation as well to have that history. It keeps a very good history of all those changes, who made those changes, and you usually leave a message about what that change is and why it was done. So it seems it's a very useful tool for how we build out that documentation and recording those changes. As a distributed system, Git sort of works in this model where everyone can have their own copy of a set of files in a file repository. And there's one sort of central hub. GitHub, if you're using the public GitHub, is instance GitLab is a similar product. Bitbucket's another one. We'll mostly talk about GitHub or GitLab here. But there's a central copy of the code, and people can take that, they can pull that into their local environment, they can make changes, and then push those changes back up to that central hub. So it makes collaborative authoring of documentation really easy. You can sort of section out who's responsible for various things. You could even work on the same files simultaneously. It'll alert you to where there are differences in those files when you try to save them back to that central hub. And you don't have to necessarily use this sort of push-pull model. GitHub and GitLab both allow you to do some basic editing directly in their web GUIs. Bitbucket is similar, and if you already use tools like Jira or Trello, it's part of that same family of companies or tools from Atlassian. So there might be some benefits to using that particular tool if you're already using those other related tools. So GitHub and GitLab, they are similar in what they perform. There's some slight differences. They're both open source and sort of operate on this freemium model. They have an online presence that anyone can use. You can also locally at your organization stand up sort of your local instance of GitHub or GitLab. At Penn State, we have a local GitLab instance, which is git.psu.edu. And it looks and acts just like if I was using the public instance of GitLab, but it's only available to folks at Penn State by default, although you can open that up later on. These local instances do make it easier sometimes if you have to restrict access to just your community of users, because it sort of is built in to have that initial layer that it's not open to the public, but you can, as you're able, open that up. Some features of these tools that are useful here, in addition to that sort of basic file level version control and tracking of changes, they both have this concept of issues or tickets. And it's a very sort of lightweight project management tool where an issue or ticket could be a task that needs to be done related to the documentation. So you need to update this section, you need to add more information. And you can use these with another feature called projects, which help you organize it. And just maybe like a to-do, doing, and done column. So it's a lightweight project management that's built into these tools for creating your documentation that everyone can see. There's also something called GitHub Pages. GitLab does have a feature like this, but it's not quite as straightforward. GitHub Pages allows you to take your code and actually create like a website from it, so you don't have to host it elsewhere. A good example of this is actually the Library of Congress's Baget Python documentation page uses GitHub Pages. So it's sort of part and parcel with the documentation itself as sort of this more web-based interface to viewing that. But most of these tools also have their own built-in wikis. It's a separate sort of repository instance from that main file section, but it does also have that version control. A quick note or thought on wikis, these ones being integrated into these version control systems provide some tools and abilities that standalone wikis tend not to have. MediaWiki or Confluence, some of the other popular ones that don't have necessarily the same version control features. Just a slight caution, a lot of times wikis that are used for documentation fall out of use fairly quickly. Wikis rode that sort of Web 2.0 wave, and sometimes people view them the same way they view microfilm. Oh, it's hard to use. I have to learn a special syntax. It's not quite the case in these integrated ones, but it is something to keep in mind. Some examples of documentation using these tools, and we'll have the links in the slide deck that's shared later. The Archivist Guide to ChiroFlux. ChiroFlux is a floppy disk controller if you need to integrate a separate, let's say 5 1/4 floppy drive, so you can read that data off from it. There's this very specific guide here for archivists to use, and some things about this particular instance. They have the main repository, where you can separate things out into a file. You can create a default file that is sort of rendered on the page. So it's not just a collection of files. It actually will render it into meaningful context and information, just like a web page would, instead of just showing you the files that make up a web page. Each of these times someone saves files, it creates a commit. And a commit is when you save files, you add a little message. You can add an expanded message if you want, but every time there's sort of a batch of changes to the files, a commit is made, which is really helpful in reviewing the history of a particular file or piece of documentation. You can have multiple people contributing and working on this documentation in a concurrent way. So it's not like it's a Word file that's locked and only one person can work on it at a time. There's also this concept called pull requests. A pull request is accepting changes. So the Archivist Guide for Chiroflux, if I was using that in my institution and I found a really neat trick or a really neat way to use it that wasn't documented in that guide, I could go to their page, I could actually make the changes I would like and then submit a pull request. And then someone who maintains that documentation will get a notification and they'll have the option to integrate my changes into the base documentation. So it's a really easy way to have multiple people participating. Another example is the UC guidelines for Born Digital Archival Description. Some things to show or talk about on that particular instance is the idea of branches. And so you have a main branch, which is a copy of your code. But if you want to make changes, let's say you're drafting a new section or you're making some revisions and you're not ready for those to be public. And a branch is sort of a copy of all of the files at one point in time, and then you can start making changes to those files. And as you complete your work, you can then merge these branches back together so all your changes show up in the main body of documentation. You can assign licenses to your documentation. You can dedicate it to the public domain, and these tools make it very easy that this license shows up visually on the page. One other concept is forking. Forking is if I want to take this UC guidelines for Born Digital Archival Description, but there's a few things in it that don't work for my organization. I could fork that documentation, which essentially makes a copy, but then I'm the manager of that copy in a separate repository. So it is still a snapshot in time, but as I begin to make changes to make them more relevant to my community, they're maintained separately. And so it's not quite as easy to merge back into that main documentation hub. I want to talk a little bit about how I'm using GitLab at Penn State for documentation. We have this GitLab instance that's just available to the Penn State community, so we can individually make things more widely available. And although it's a bit of a work in progress, having this ability to track who's making changes where has been very beneficial. And we use both sort of the file repository as well as the wiki portion of these tools, where the file repository has our more formal codifications of policy or our digital object guidelines for creating and assigning identifiers. The wiki is a little more like working documentation and describing the workflows and sort of thinking it's the bottom half of that graph that Carly showed earlier. And I just wanted to point out a great resource, and we'll include the link in the slides, but docs.rockarc.org. The Rockefeller Archives Center has done something, taken this to the next step and created an entire documentation platform based on Git. It's a really neat interface and works very well. We'll make sure we get that link included. Other options, if you don't want to go down that route of using a version control system, are things that are more familiar to us, websites, blogs, content management systems. So we have, these are more sort of web-based technologies. A lot of us probably have intranets that we can use. A lot of these do have some flavor of version control in them, but maybe not the same robustness that GitHub or GitLab offers. But usually in a content management system, sometimes they're a little clunky. I have a particular disdain for Adobe CQ if anyone's used that before. So sometimes that itself can be a bit of a barrier of people not wanting to take the time to work on documentation because the process is painful to them in some way. You can fine-tune permissions usually and use plugins or different tools so that only certain people can have access. It's a little harder on internet to later open it up to a broader audience. A lot of times they are sort of officially segmented and you can only access them when you're on your local network or if you're using some sort of authentication process. So it's usually a little harder to make those public. Something similar here is a knowledge bank. We provide a link to the Digital Preservation Coalition knowledge base, which is sort of like an FAQ or a set of questions and answers or a theme and documentation on that theme that really creates a foundation of knowledge that people can go and look at a very specific, what is it that I need to know? That's a good resource to look at for thinking about knowledge bases. Sometimes they're called knowledge banks. Digitize UC was an example of documentation where you're just using HTML, regular old websites. But the benefit of creating something that way is you can totally customize the view and how it works and what happens when you click. So if there's something very particular about your documentation that maybe needs to integrate third-party technology, sometimes it's a little easier to do if you're just using a regular website approach. However, think about the long-term maintenance and sustainability about these approaches and who has access to those files to update them and how that will change over time. So something else that's already been brought up here is these sort of productivity tools and software, whether it's Google Drive, OneDrive, Office 365, Office Documents, and then we also have general cloud storage. So if you are going to be using these tools, try to really leverage some of the more modern features like collaborative authoring and editing. A lot of them also do offer versioning of some sort. I know in Google Documents, you can go and save a version, name a version at that point in time. Although you can always go back and roll through the changes. It's under, I think, the file menu item. You can sort of name an official point. So if your documentation is sort of at your 1.0, shall we say, it's at a baseline, you could create that version 1.0 so it's easy to jump back to. You don't have to think about, oh, what date and time did I make that change? And then as you make substantial changes, you could introduce different version points so you can roll back and take a look at those. So if you're going this route, try to change it up maybe from how you've used or created documentation using these tools in the past. For example, try not to make separate copies. If it's a new version, use that version history feature. If you have multiple people working on it, share a link to that document and have everyone use that link to access it rather than making a copy. This was always something in sort of the network shared folder environment. You end up with lots of copies of the same thing with different extensions on the file name. And over time, it becomes difficult to know what is the authoritative source here? What is the one I should be looking at and what's the one I should be using? So try to think about how you can leverage those new tools, new features in these tools for collaborative authoring and concurrent access of your documentation.
Sorry, I didn't unmute myself. So in this section, we want to discuss a few places that you can go to either borrow documentation and workflows from other institutions or other professionals, and to also share ones that really work out for you and that you want to share with the larger community. But for right now, we're really interested to know where you go for inspiration or help when writing or improving your existing documentation. So in the chat, please share some of your favorite resources or portals for consulting documentation. And we're gonna wait a little bit so we don't miss any good comments.
And if you don't have any, perhaps we can provide some good tips today.
Yeah, go ahead and advance. I know this is probably, COSA is probably a community that you consult for for tips or for help. I know I'm a member of the Big Ten, and so I'm frequently reaching out to Big Ten colleagues and asking to share, documentations and what's your workflow for this? What's your workflow for that? So, yeah, there's lots of different places. So we highly encourage you to beg, borrow, and politely steal workflow or documentation strategies with the proper attribution, of course. And the digital preservation field especially is a very open community where sharing and transforming is highly encouraged. And this is great for the individual who needs help writing local documentation, but it really also moves us forward as a field in better understanding how to preserve and care for digital collections. So here are a few portals where attempts have been made to openly share documentation, and a few are more successful than others, but I think they're good places to keep an eye on. The first one, community-owned workflows, or COW, which I feel, in my personal opinion, wins the acronym competition. And this is a community that's created and hosted by Copter, the community-owned digital preservation tool registry, which is another great resource for learning about digital preservation tools. And this was really created out of a need for the digital preservation community to share and pool their knowledge and workflows. At this point, though, it doesn't appear to be very active. There are only a couple workflows uploaded, which is a chronic issue in our field, trying to keep community-owned resources up to date. But still, I think that the effort and the spirit is there. Secondly, maybe something you're familiar with, the Library Workflow Exchange. It's a place to post and share workflows and best practices across institutions. A place to go and see what other folks are up to. They have faceted searches, so you can search a wide range of topics for any type of workflow that you are looking for. Open Workflows is a list of workflows and resources specifically related to AV archiving, and it covers documentation and transfer stations and digitization lab specifications, scripts and tools and metadata. And again, there's an open invitation to contribute additional resources to that as well. OSSArcFlow is a grant project run by a Decopia Institute, and it ran from 2017 to 2019, and investigated and modeled a range of born digital curation workflows using the open source tools BitCurator, Archivematica, and ArchiveSpace. So on that project website, you can find reports and workflows from institutions, from partner institutions, and see the diverse ways that these three tools were used to create a digital curation workflow at individual institutions. So I think it's really interesting to see how pieces and components of these open source tools were implemented. Let's see. Oh, I see a COSA Resource Center is a good resource to consult. Thanks for that comment.
So for remote documentation projects, we tried to add some timely aspects to this presentation. And as I think there was a chat message already about someone working on documentation now, I figured out how to get the chat open while presenting. We're curious to hear, are other people working on remote documentation projects as we're into this work from home moment? And if so, what are the biggest obstacles you're facing in doing those projects remotely? I can imagine not having access to your normal systems and equipment, for example, could be hard perhaps to know their details on them or what that workflow might need to be. System congestion. Well, we found that out was a problem today with WebEx. Emailing back and forth, not versioning. That can be a tricky one. It also clogs up your email. Think about the record retention's perspective of email, and if these aren't deleted, that these take up space, and then are they things you want to come forth in discovery later on? So we had some ideas and thoughts about remote documentation projects. Some ideas that you could put into place for projects at this point. So take an inventory of all of the existing documentation you have, and what is its status? Is it current? Has it been superseded? Does no one even know the status? Just to get a handle, and this can be an ongoing task. I know at Penn State, I occasionally still stumble upon things that I never knew existed. So you might want to talk to, longtime employees or people, maybe even retirees, who might have some ideas about where existing documentation might live. A lot of times, even though the actual practices might have changed slightly, there's still good nuggets in that documentation to take a look at. Update existing documentation to reflect your current workflows. What is the ground truth? Is your documentation reflect something you did 5 years ago and you've moved on from there? Did the audio cut out? Can folks hear?
I can hear.
Okay, I'm going to assume it's working for other folks then. Carol says she can hear. So think about the gaps in your documentation. I like this idea of a mental download of your institutional knowledge. What are the things that you or others might know that isn't formally documented somewhere that could affect work? And this comes into play whenever there's sort of attrition or transitions in organizations. When you lose institutional knowledge, try to capture that while you can. Ask if you have a team of folks, maybe ask them to think about this, and it could almost be a journaling exercise that could later then be sorted through and have things pulled out into a formal documentation. If you're struggling to manage your documentation and to really have something cohesive, think about some of the options we presented here with version control systems and intranets and blogs, and what is the best fit for your audience and your community. If that is going to be a change or a shift to something new, maybe take some steps towards planning that and what that might look like in the future. If you are moving into some sort of new platform, maybe there's some migration or converting of old documentation. Maybe those binders, those dusty binders on the bookshelves that we haven't looked at, maybe there's still something in there that we need to bring into an electronic format that's not just a scanned PDF. Another great resource, which most folks on here probably have already seen, is the Archivist at Home Guide. There's some mentions there of documentation, as well as some other great work from home projects. So now it's going to get interesting. Oops, got to advance.
Yeah, so now is the opportunity for us all to learn from each other, and also for you to reflect on and process your own experiences in creating and using documentation. We really wanted to build in a little reflection time to this webinar because cognitive research has shown that it's so important for us as learners to have time to process what we've just heard and apply that to our past experiences and current projects. We have about 10 minutes left in this webinar, so it's going to be a little truncated reflection time, but I think we'll work it out if you want to advance, Nathan. So yeah, go ahead.
We're going to present some topics that folks might want to focus on for documentation, and each of these topics has a Google Doc linked to it, and it's a short URL. You can just type it in. And what we'd like to do is to have folks choose a topic that is interesting to you or that you'd like to get feedback on, and then go into the Google document and start to share some of your challenges and successes. We'll be a bit truncated here, but Carly and I will be monitoring those, and maybe we'll share some things out to the larger group here and sort of reconvene for some quick recap and Q&A.
I have chatted the links to the Google Docs into the chat. So we have 3 main discussion areas that if you're interested in, you can go in and comment on these areas. So documentation format and approaches for versioning, getting other staff involved in documentation work, and determining the granularity or what level of detail is needed for creating or updating documentation. And then I've also created a miscellaneous category for anything that doesn't really fit into these three other areas that you can feel free to, add just general tips on documentation if you've experienced something that's worked positively. And we do want to acknowledge that lack of time and resources is really a universal pain point when it comes to this work. So we're all feeling it. But yeah, so please take 4 or 5 minutes and visit these documents. They'll be available to you for as long as you have the link, and we'll be sure to send them on with the slide deck as well. And then, while we're doing this process, if you have any questions, you can feel free to chat them through Cisco WebEx.
And maybe leave your name as you're typing in. So if someone else has that same challenge, for example, they want to know how did you solve that, it makes it easy to go back and know who to contact. Because right now we're all anonymous dinosaurs and wolverines. Yeah, so I'm reading one right now from Josh Hager at the State Archives in North Carolina. Difficult to balance the need for clarity versus accounting for every little part of that workflow, right? So how do we avoid so much detail that you get lost in the important aspects of those? If anyone has some good tips there. Sometimes you almost need like an executive summary to the or an overview to the documentation. I personally tend to be someone who over documents.
Same. I'm the creator of the 50-page PDF. But yeah, it is. I think thinking back to that first slide with the 4 types of documentation really hit home for me, and how I can piecemeal these things out. And there's a place for the nitty-gritty, but there's a place for the overview too. I see a good one coming through in the staff involvement document about demographic transition and getting older and retiring staff members to record their knowledge. That's kind of transition planning, and that's an important thing to incorporate as well.
On that same doc, I see a challenge for staff feeling that if they participate in the documentation process, that they somehow diminish their own usefulness. And this is interesting because it sort of harkens back to the days of guilds where our knowledge was specialized and you couldn't learn from a master because you had to figure it out yourself. They were very protective. And so trying to think about, that this is really about a team and a team mentality for trying to achieve a goal, and maybe removing some of the personalization from it, but that we're all working towards that same goal.
Mm-hmm.
A really great one, and the granularity of detail. So our archive does a pretty good job at documenting why workflow decisions were made for future staff. That's something that can sometimes get overlooked. And then later on, well, why did we do it this way, right? Oh, that doesn't seem to make sense. And so you change it and then realize maybe soon on, oh, this was why.
They already tried it that way. It didn't work for these reasons. Yeah.
Probably, do you think we should there's still a lot of great comments being written in the Google Docs here, and these can continue to be added to and shared after the fact, but should we pivot to some broader Q&A, do you think?
Yeah, yep, let's do that. And please continue, typing in your, these are great. This is going to be a great resource going forward. So please continue to write in your comments.
Yep, we can leave these open for a good long while, maybe through the end of the day or even through the end of the week, and then post PDF versions along with the slide deck and the webinar recording.
That sounds great. And this is Nathan's dog that you see. What's your dog's name, Nathan?
This is Bernice, Bernice Sparrowhound.
Or should I say your coworker these days, huh?
Yeah. Got 2 Rottweilers at my feet right now. I have a lot of dogs. Are there any general questions or about anything we brought up today?
I think people may still be over at the
Sure.
documents.
That's a great problem to have.
I see the Connecticut State Archives is sort of limited in the choices of corporate software that doesn't work necessarily in government contexts. So I would think about what are those collaborative features that might be newer in there that you could use. I see someone says they're not sure how to advocate the need for access to versioning software. Well, the GitHub and GitLab, you could sign up for a free account and start using it. And if you have sort of a team on there, you could limit it to folks on that team. So there is some still ability to lock things down rather than making it fully public. But it might be at least a way to experiment and test and do a proof of concept.
Yeah, I think for implementing new tool or new to you tools or new to your organization tools, it's all a testing period is vital, and a feedback period as well. I at one institution tried to implement a wiki for documentation and soon realized that wouldn't fit with the culture of our institution, but luckily had kind of built in a little test process so that I was able to learn that without investing too much time into the wiki.
I think that reminds me of a good point, Carly. Always sort of think about migration and exit strategies, even for your documentation, not just your collection. So if you are choosing a new technology, don't do something that's going to lock you in too much. So, if you're building a WordPress content management system, sometimes it's hard to get stuff out of WordPress if it's just content there. So I see someone, how do you get staff to document as they go? I think documentation often doesn't happen because it's undertaken after a project or process is completed. Yes, you don't want to do it too far at the end. Right? It's like digital preservation. You should bake it in. It's the yeast in the bread that you put in at the beginning to make all the magic happen. You do have to make time for it. It is an investment. Oh, we have a question. How should we advocate to our RT department? We need access. We need access to the versioning softwares. You might point out the examples that we have here with the Archivist Guide to ChiroFlux, or show them this presentation about how those benefits of using that works for the community. There's been some great resources over the past couple of years about how archivists can communicate and work better with IT departments. I know OCLC had a report. Scott Prager from University of Wisconsin had a paper on it. So there might be some tips there to look for as well. GitHub was a blocked site. Okay.
Mm.
They might be able to open a particular GitHub URL. So maybe not all of GitHub could be open, but if you created a repository on GitHub, maybe they could open up just that URL so that it's accessible to the community. Oh, great comment, Veronica. How's IT managing their documentation?
Yeah, I think a lot of what we're seeing now, a great place to consult for any type of documentation work is the IT community. And so kind of joining in to see what your IT department is using would be really beneficial, not only for, getting access to it, but also because IT has to keep really good documentation on their workflows and protocols. And so we can learn a lot from their practices.
And I would think about too, if GitHub is blocked, and even if you are able to get an exception there, think about your community of users, and is it going to be something that is familiar and conducive to creating and maintaining documentation, or because they might have to jump through hoops, will that be a barrier?
It is 3:02 p.m. and I realize some of you can and will hang around. Others have other obligations. So this might be a good time to start wrapping things up a little bit. Nathan, if you'd forward the slide. Okay, we encourage you to stay connected and informed, particularly during these difficult times, via COSA's website, via Twitter, and by COSA's Facebook page. And Nathan, if you'd advance the next slide. Okay, when you close out of this webinar screen, you will see a brief survey. It should take you 30 to 60 seconds to complete, less than a couple of minutes. We really do encourage you to complete the survey. We really do read them. We really do review the results. They help to shape our future offerings and the way we publicize material, our upcoming webinars, so on and so forth. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Carly and Nathan, if you want to stick around for a few minutes, just in case anyone has some last-minute questions, that would be great. Otherwise, we hope you all stay well, stay safe, and we'll see you in May. We will post the recording, the webinar slides, and the final versions of the Google Docs to the COSA State Archivist website shortly. Thanks so much, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.